Welcome to the Burn Bootcamp podcast. I'm your host, Morgan Klein, co-founder and CEO, along with my husband and company visionary, Devan Klein.
And together, with our amazing team, we are going to help you push past your limits, not just physically in our gyms, but right here, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually on the Burn Bootcamp podcast.
Together, we will take on challenges and break through barriers to transform into the best possible version of ourselves. We are more than a gym. We are a community. Your community. Let's go, Burn Nation.
Burn Nation, welcome back to the Burn Bootcamp podcast. I am your host, Devan Klein, visionary and co-founder of Burn. And today is episode 509, and I have a great one for you. This episode stems off the back of episode 508, where we talked all about mental resilience. And as always, we'll follow up our main episodes with a short version called Ask Devan Anything, where we go deeper into one kind of section or one nuance or one idea that we shared on the previous podcast of this week. So this question comes from Mary at Zionsville, Indiana. Shout out to Maggie and Ben Browning, our franchise partners of this location. And she asks, can you share with me, please, the science behind mental resilience? So what I wanted to do today to frame this for you all is really walk through 5 key points in your journey as you come through Burn Bootcamp, and then really what's happening behind the scenes mentally and how we relate the physical adaptation to the neurological adaptation. And so let's do that if you don't mind. And before we do that, we have a YouTube channel, the Burn Bootcamp podcast. I want you to go to there right now and subscribe if you're not already there. Or if you're an Apple listener, you can leave us a review on Apple. And by the way, we have an Instagram handle now, the Burn Bootcamp podcast, at Burn Bootcamp Podcast on Instagram. And as always, you can hit me up with any questions that you have for ADA Ask Devan Anything at devan.klein on Instagram. Okay, so let me just walk you through my journey here, okay? And I go to camp 6 days a week, 5 days a week, but 6 days a week a lot of times. And I know that so many of you, when you first come into Burn Bootcamp, you get a little anxious. You get a little excited maybe, okay? When you walk in and you step on that floating floor, and I'm the same way, you get a stress trigger, okay? Now stress might have like a negative connotation to it, but I'm not talking about bad stress, like trauma or unchosen stress. I'm talking about good stress. We call it controlled microstress, and this is voluntary for you, okay? So when you step on the floating floor, the music hits, your heart rate gets up. What happens is your brain, okay, your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight mechanism starts to detect a threat. And I don't know if you detect your trainer as a threat, but when I step onto the floor and Ashley Beasley's my trainer, I'm like, there's my threat right there. She's coming after me today. And you actually have a sympathetic nervous response to this, okay? First, what happens is noradrenaline or norepinephrine, which is released by the nerve endings, increases your heart rate because it keeps you alert. It's that fight or flight mechanism. It raises your blood pressure, releases glucose so that you regulate your blood sugar. And so, you are first aware, okay? You're first kind of like, okay, I am, there's something going on here, I need to get my body prepared. And then second, your adrenaline increases, okay? So the adrenaline is released from the adrenal gland, which makes sense. And this is going to basically increase your focus, increase your alertness to an all-time high, okay? And because we want to protect ourselves, and this sympathetic nervous system is there to do so. And now I'm saying it's good stress versus bad stress. And so you're putting yourself into this voluntary stress. There's a big, big difference between voluntary stress and unchosen traumatic stress, okay? So that's what happens when you first hit that floating floor. And then, that you come across a fork in the road. There's this decision point about halfway through camp where this fatigue starts to set in and your muscles are burning. What's actually happening is you're producing lactate in the muscles, and they burn. Okay, your brain is receiving the stress signal from your actual body, and what happens is this emotional limbic brain. There's a structure in the limbic system called the amygdala, and the amygdala is like the monkey mind, the lizard brain, the emotional mind. Okay, this has a interesting relationship with your prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of your brain here. And so you get to that decision point when your amygdala, just because we're emotional beings, is like, stop, no, don't do anymore. This is bad for you. But then, because we're logical human beings, and that's what makes us different as creatures, as animals, is we have this prefrontal cortex, we actually can override that panic. Okay, we can actually train our brain to say, okay, you know what, you silly monkey mind, keep pushing. Okay, this is voluntary stress. This isn't unchosen stress. So keep pushing. It's all good. And guys, this is the actual mechanism, right? The emotional brain versus the executive brain, and the interaction between these two, and the ability for your executive brain to override your emotional brain. This is mental resilience. This is actually the mechanism around mental resilience and how you build it, and you actually do build it, because the brain has a characteristic called neuroplasticity, and what that actually means is you're just able to change your brain. You've heard maybe the way your brain fires and wires together, or something along those lines. This is actually true. Your brain has different parts that fire together, and the parts that fire together wire together. And you can actually change your brain, and this is called neurological tolerance. And the reason I want to tell you this stuff is because I want you to know that your ability to change your character, to change your personality, to change the way that you look at emotion. If you're somebody who lives in negative emotion, you can actually really change that. And we see this all the time at Burn Boot Camp, because this is happening in the background, whether you want to know it or not. But if you actually understand it and you can make those connections, the knowing, that perspective of, hey, this is happening regardless, now that you know, you can keep it top of mind, right? And you can actually understand how to fire and wire your brain, and the fact that you can override your negative emotions, and you don't have to be stuck in this place where you're just a negative person, okay? Okay, so now step 3, and we talked about this in episode 508 pretty deeply, this idea of cognitive reappraisal, or very, very simply, just the ability for your mind to go backwards in time and reappraise or reassociate meaning. Listen, the reason that we have suffering is because we are creating a conflict in our head. We are creating a story in our head that's actually not true. How many times do you know somebody that just comes up with this narrative, this disempowering narrative that creates this conflict, when in actuality, actual truth, universal truth, that's not the case, but it becomes their own personal truth, okay? So this kind of step 3 that you go through during the process at camp is called the reframe. This a lot of times comes from your trainer. Okay, or it might come from like a high five or from a member in camp. The trainer says something along the lines of like, you're not tired, you're tough. Or, we don't give in to pain because pain is power. What we're trying to do is take something that has a negative association and give it a positive association, right? Because we have the ability to kind of reappraise these, these mantras that we have. How many of us out there, raise your hand, close your eyes, think about something that you believe that your parents installed in you, the university you went to installed in you, and you actually don't really believe it. It's just something that somebody told you along the way, and you're like, oh, that sounds good, right? I had this moment where I listened to Gary Vee for a very long time. He's a marketing guy. Many of you probably know who Gary Vee is. And he said, by the way, I think his marketing mind is a genius, but he said, have no expectations of anybody else around you. And I was like, okay, that sounds good. He's like, that's a way to be happy. I was like, okay, that sounds good. No expectations of anyone else around me. That's a way to be happy. Well, then I said that to my wife, that wasn't the best idea, because we need to have expectations of one another, right? And, like I said, Gary Vee's a great marketing mind, but Gary Vee got divorced. So I probably shouldn't listen to somebody whose outcomes are not the same as mine in terms of my desires, who is actually giving me this advice without actually thinking for myself. So no, I don't think that you shouldn't have expectations of others. I think you should have high expectations of others. And I also think that you should have the expectation that others have high expectations of themselves. And so I needed a reframe, okay, because that belief system wasn't working for my life, okay? So this is the act of cognitive reappraisal, and this is that reinterpretation of pain is power, like pain hurts, and I don't like working out because it's painful, into boom, pain is power. And you hear our trainers all the time over the mic reframe. This is part of what we train our 2,000 plus trainers in Burn Nation to. We actually teach them to give public speeches over the mic so that you can actually take their words and then use them in real life. What we're doing is helping you reframe. There's this place in your prefrontal cortex. It's called the ventrolateral. Okay, I know it's very sciencey and nerdy, but I want you to know this. The ventrolateral part of the prefrontal cortex. And I actually wrote about this in Stop Starting Over. And this is a very highly neuroplastic part of your brain. And I'm going to give you a metaphor for it, okay? So the ventrolateral part of the prefrontal cortex is like a bouncer. It's like a bouncer, a big giant bouncer named Rocco. And Rocco is this big guy who he just like keeps all the negative emotion out. All right, this is like the positivity part of your brain. This is what activated when you have positive self-talk, okay? It stops negative emotion. This part of your brain stops negative emotion. And so when you reframe, when you do this cognitive appraisal, both in camp and the micro, but more importantly, everybody, if you listen to episode 508, going back and reappraising what the most 1, 2, or 3 meaningful experiences in your life are, going back and giving those an empowering meaning is a way to rewire and refire different neurons in your prefrontal cortex, specifically in the ventrolateral part of it. And now you can literally be less negative. Like, it's not just about thinking positively. You actually have to go back and reassociate meaning in the micro and in the macro. By the way, in 508, again, I know I'm referencing this a lot, but I really want you to listen to it because these two, 508 and 509, go together. This is why we talked about EQ, emotional quotient or emotional intelligence, as opposed to IQ, intellectual quotient or intellectual intelligence. This is the difference where IQ is stagnant. EQ is actually something you can practice. It is a skill. And I want you all to know that your emotional capacity can and will either grow or decline. There's no such thing as life in between. You're either getting better or you're getting worse from an emotional intelligence perspective. And so this is why we talk about, and this is what I learned from Tony Robbins long ago. When you change your story, when you change the narrative that you're telling yourself, then you change your emotional state. Change your story, change your state. All conflict, all suffering is because you're telling yourself a disempowering story. When you have the ability, now you know the science behind the ability. You have the ability to actually change the way your brain works by changing the story you tell yourself, by going backward in time and practicing this cognitive reappraisal. Okay, so now we're going to kind of step 4 in camp, where, all right, now you're like getting to the end. What do we call the end at camp? What do we call it? The finisher. Okay. You dominate this finisher. You get big high fives from your trainer. You get big high fives from your team. Your dopamine floods. Now, this dopamine word, you've heard it before, but it's a very tricky word. Why? Because you have instant gratification that causes dopamine, and you have delayed gratification that causes dopamine, or like what I like to call cheap dopamine versus earned dopamine. What are some cheap versions of dopamine? Sugar, TV, social media. What are some earned ways of dopamine? Camp, anything that working out, anything that causes effort, good nutrition choices. Okay, it's this idea of delayed gratification versus instant gratification. And so when you dominate that finisher, you're going to get this kind of micro victory lap. Okay, you're going to get this victory lap of dopamine because you just earned it. And this is the earned type of dopamine. This is the delayed gratification. This is why you went through all of that pain. This is why you cognitively reappraised. Pain is suffering. Pain is power. You did that in the short term, so by the end of camp at 45 minutes, you now have the opportunity to pat yourself on the back, to get a high five from your trainer, dominating that finisher and saying, hey, this dopamine that I feel, this rush of positive energy that I feel, this was earned, okay? And what you're actually doing when you delay gratification, back to that word neuroplasticity, or the ability for your brain to change, okay? What you're actually doing is you're building these very resilient memory traces, okay? You can think about them as like neural grooves. They're like grooves in your brain that kind of house this memory. Scientists will call them neural pathways. You might have heard that before. But basically, that's, again, that group of neurons, neuroplasticity, it's the ability for them to wire and fire together. The more you use these neural pathways, these neural grooves, the more you delay gratification and you're focused on earned dopamine rather than cheap dopamine, the stronger these pathways get. And this is why I talk about the same way that you build hypertrophy in a gym through progressive overload is the same way your neurological tolerance or your mental resilience has an actual progressive overload to it, because now you can actually continue to compound over time these firing and these wiring of neurons. And if you go back to episode 508, you're going to hear my tree trunk example. You're going to hear of how you plant a little baby seed and then you let that seed grow and grow and grow and grow. And by the time you water it enough, right, and the watering in the sunlight and the nourishing of the seed is actually a metaphor for delayed gratification. Now all of a sudden, the reason you're doing all of that harvesting or the seed planting is so that you can harvest a giant oak tree in the future. You are delaying the gratification. And the other side of this metaphor is that big oak tree, okay, that the neurological pathways, the neural grooves that you're building, that oak tree is much harder to destroy than that little seedling that pops out of the ground, okay? And then here's what happens after camp. After now you're done with camp, you have this adaptation phase, okay? This is kind of part 2 of what happens post-camp. You have this adaptation phase where I always tell our members, like, the reason we're doing the finisher is because I want you to leave the gym stronger than when you came in the gym. That way, when you come in the gym tomorrow, you're a stronger version than when you came into today. And that is a compounding effect, camp after camp after camp after camp. And it is the physical and it's the neural progressive overload working hand in hand together. I am not creating the mind-body connection for you, but what I'm doing is I'm reinforcing the mind-body connection so that you actually can think about and have at the front of your mind the fact that you have neural pathways and that the stronger they get, the more mentally resilient you become. Okay, and then what happens, because we just went through this like sympathetic nervous system, or the SNS, right, which is really what I talked about with the adrenal glands and the noradrenaline and the nerve endings and that whole spiel up front. That is the fight or flight mechanism. Okay, that's the system that's like, run, there's a tiger coming, or run, you're in cold water, or run, this workout's really hard, or ouch, this hurts, stop doing this. And then your prefrontal cortex says, no, buddy, you're gonna be just fine. We've done this before. That gets stronger. And then kick in the PNS, the parasympathetic nerve system. This is not fight or flight like sympathetic. This is rest and recover. This is when your heart rate slows down. This is when, like, you outran the saber-toothed tiger and now you're just chilling under a tree eating a banana. Back in the day, I mean, all our brains haven't changed in a very, very long time, since any of us can go back and trace scientifically. We have a very, very, very similar, if not identical, neurological makeup. And so you're going to do the same thing, only it's not tigers nowadays. It's like working out, and it's an uncontrolled stress, controlled stress. But it's going to this idea of the parasympathetic nervous system kicking in, causing you to rest and recover, allowing your heart rate to slow down, reactivates digestion, stimulates hormone balance, etc., muscle repair, muscle protein synthesis. So you effectively are becoming less reactive when you practice this non-reactivity by introducing these voluntary controlled microstressors, firing your sympathetic nervous system up, and then relaxing after camp, resting and recovering. This is why, y'all, we're building in Sundays. This is why we don't have camp on Sundays. Because all you crazy burn boot camp crazies out there who want to go 6 days a week like me, I'm all for it. That's why we have 3 strength days and 3 conditioning days. That's why we have these splits, right? So that you can actually train hard without overloading any one group. So you can progressive overload. Burn is made to come 6 days a week, okay? It's not just your traditional boot camp where you go outside and you do bear crawls every day and sprints every day and do the same burpees every day. No. It is very broken down, and I won't go into that on this podcast. There's plenty of other podcasts that we go really deep on it, but I just want you to realize that that is why we actually have some of this stuff built in. And kind of the last step is you carry this over into your life. Now this, like, here's where it really matters, okay? Because I'm talking about working out. I'm talking about your experience in the gym, but that's just 45 minutes of your 23 of the other 23 hours and 15 minutes of your day. What happens? What type of uncontrolled stress, what type of traumatic stress happens? Right? This is why we go under voluntary stress, so that we can handle the involuntary stress, the stuff that just comes at you, the world that just wants to beat you down, so that you can handle these things with more resilience. Later on in the day, the boss triggers you, your wife, your spouse triggers you, your kids trigger you. I know Trisha talks about, just how camp and how her discipline at camp has really helped her, without knowing all the mechanisms scientifically behind it, has really just helped her become a more patient mom. She's just more patient. She doesn't snap at her kids when they do kid things. I'm the same way. If I miss my workout for a few days, which rarely happens, but it happens, I'm a worse dad. I snap at my kids a little bit quicker because I'm losing my ability to regulate my emotions because I'm not voluntarily putting myself into it. And if you don't water the oak tree starts to die. You're either growing or you're dying. So keep at your workouts. Keep it as an anchor to your life. 4, 5, 6 days a week. Why? Because the boss is going to come at you. Because your spouse, sometimes they'll come at you. Your kids are going to come at you. Someone in your family is going to die. Something traumatic is going to happen where life inevitably is not about whether you suffer or not. It's about how you handle the suffering. And that is why we stay in the gym. It's not about muscles and six packs. That's a byproduct of what really matters. Becoming mentally resilient. Controlling your emotion. So that when it's time for you to show up for your family, for your community, for your spouse, for your children, that you're the person that people lean on. That you don't have to lean on anybody else. That is mental toughness. Mental toughness is not willpower. Mental toughness is exposing yourself voluntarily to stress. It's exposure therapy. It's doing things that are hard on purpose, because when you do things that are hard on purpose, you then become a person who does hard things, and your personality starts to change. That's episode 509 for you guys. Go back, listen to 508, 509 back to back. And like I said, we are now live on YouTube with all of our podcasts. Please subscribe on YouTube so that you do not miss a single episode. We're turning up the heat. We're gaining a ton of momentum. I feel like I'm hitting my groove on the podcast. What do you guys think over there, studio? Jordan, we got Chelsea in the building. Make sure you thank them if you want to throw out a comment on YouTube. And as of course, always, my co-host Trisha Pena. Shout her out as well, everybody. Devan.Klein on Instagram. I'd love to hear from you on one of those channels. Until next time, 2 claps on 2, 1, 2.